Okay, well, welcome everybody to the first panel this afternoon. We have three stimulating papers on variously the memories of economic transformation and of dissidents from the years around 1989. The first speaker today will be Florian from the Institute for Contemporary History in Berlin. This is part of a broader project that you also are part of on the economic transformation of parts of Central Eastern Europe more broadly. Anyway, Florian, the floor is yours. You have each of 20 minutes. We might have very brief questions after each paper, but the majority of the discussion will take place at the end.
Thank you very much for introducing me. I will talk about, as you will, I hope you will see in a second, about therapy mythology. So about the contested memories of Poland's Balcerowicz plan, mainly. As most of you know for sure, talking about this memory of post-socialist transformation in present-day Poland is anything but safe ground. Rather, it resembles walking over a minefield. As in many Central and Eastern European countries, Polish memories of the transformation era remain highly polarized and have grown even more politicized than before. Only a few, I hope this works now this way, only a few months ago, the 30th anniversary of the first semi-free elections in Eastern Europe on June the 4th, 1989, provided one more occasion for observing this division of public memory. While the Gdansk local authorities organized a 10-day festival celebrating the historical breakthrough of 1989, the national government showed unusually little interest in engaging in public remembrance. In short, the public memory of the Polish transition of 1989 is overshadowed by a head-on clash of two competing foundational myths. Liberals celebrate the Polish Roundtable and the subsequent semi-free elections as key steps in the completion of the Solidarity Revolution begun in 1980, providing self-liberation from Soviet Union, the successful establishment of parliamentary democracy, and the long-awaited return to Europe. This triumphalist success story is challenged by a mainly conservative counter-narration denouncing the Roundtable agreements as a shady deal between left-leaning opposition elites and their communist counterparts, which ultimately resulted in a conservation of the communist system and its social political order. Jarosław Szarek, a right-wing historian serving as head of the Institute of National Remembrance, might not wear such patriotic t-shirts produced by the Red is Bad label, but nonetheless he purports that after, I quote, after 1989 the decoration has been changed but the instruments of power stayed in the hand of the people of the old system, end of quote. On another occasion, Szarek even compared the Roundtable Agreement between the communists and the liberal opposition elites to the division of Europe after the Second World War by the Allied powers in Yalta, insinuating that both were deals above the head of ordinary Poles and to their disadvantage. In this view, liberal opposition elites simply betrayed Poles by revoking the truly anti-communist revolution that should have taken place then. When it comes to the economic side of the transformation, opinions are no less divided. Unlike the political quarrels among the old and new elites, transformation from plant to market economy had major impacts on the everyday life of nearly everyone living in Central and Eastern Europe at the time. As it turned out to be a protracted and troublesome process all over the region, it necessarily resulted in quite diverse experiences of individual success or failure. Nonetheless, public memory of economic transformation is predominantly cultivated in distinct national discourses and has typically become attached to national points of reference, even though transformation shared strong common features throughout Central and Eastern Europe, and even though the sellout of national wealth to foreign capital and the neoliberal hegemony of the time, embodied in the so-called Washington Consensus, have emerged as central points of critique to it. Still, the fathers of success and the culprits for failure are always national ones in the first place. While in East Germany, the role of Old Nick is played by the Treuhand, the bureaucratic state agency responsible for privatizing, liquidating the assets of the DDR industry. In Poland, a similar role is attributed to Leszek Balcerowicz. The author of the macroeconomic stabilization program introduced by the first non-communist government in January 1990, which has become known as the Polish shock therapy. Already back in 1990, Balcerowicz musi odejść, Balcerowicz has to go emerged as a key political slogan for Polish anti-establishment movements. It reached its first heyday during Lech Wałęsa's presidential campaign in autumn 1990, and it was subsequently caught up by Andrzej Lepar's rural Samo-Obrona movement. Ever since, Poles seem to be either enthusiasts or fierce critics of Balcerowicz, who is portrayed either as the father of Poland's economic miracle or as a cold-blooded Mengele of the Polish economy. It might not come as a surprise that Balcerowicz and his shock therapy policies are strongly supported from the camp of liberal transformation elites. It is, however, astonishing that this support reaches at times comical levels. On the occasion of Balcerowicz's 17th birthday in 2017, Adam Michnik, former propaganda dissident and long-standing editor of the leading liberal Gazeta Wyborcza newspaper, compared Balcerowicz to Baron Münchhausen, who pulled himself out of the mire by his own hair. Like Münchhausen, Michnik contended Leszek pulled the Polish economy out of the mire, which was really in ruins then in 1989. Even those liberal intellectuals who have recently shown more readiness to admit that the liberal reform camp has indeed committed several political mistakes during the transformation period, like Martin Kohl, continue to praise Balcerowicz as an unerring fighter for economic freedom. Kohl even contends that Poland would have needed a second Balcerowicz for pushing the state-owned economy towards fast privatization. Typically, liberals do not negate the social hardships caused by Balcerowicz's radical monetarist policies, but justify them as the inevitable price that had to be paid for transformation to capitalism. In their opinion, shock therapy laid the ground for later economic success. A vernacularized version of this view has been voiced by Christina, a visitor to the Gdansk Remembers Festival this year. I quote, well, there were layoffs, there was unemployment, it was hard for the people, but take a look around. Today, we have a beautiful Poland. End of quote. While this liberal master narrative of political democratization, while the liberal master narrative of political democratization is mainly challenged by the political right, Balcerowicz and his economic transformation policies draw criticism from both left and right-wing positions. Although these two critical narrations share certain elements and sometimes overlap in surprising ways, they do in fact differ fundamentally. Left-wing criticism focuses mainly on the unduly high social costs of the rapid establishment of capitalist social order, such as massive unemployment, skyrocketing income inequalities, and material as well as symbolic deprivation of the workers. It challenges the contemporary ideological preference for a poor capitalist market economy without sufficient welfare provisions. In contrast, right-wing adversaries of Balcerowicz are far from questioning the emergence of a capitalist social structure based on private property or of the means of production. Instead, they rather scandalize that property and privileged social positions have been taken over by what they consider the wrong beneficiaries of transformation, namely the old communist nomenclatura and foreign capital. In the field of academic economics, the first outspoken critics of Balcerowicz identified themselves with the political left, most prominently Grzegorz Kołotko and Tadeusz Kowalik. They criticized the Balcerowicz plan for its excessively monetarist approach, which in their opinion resulted in a triple overshooting in terms of fiscal discipline and provoked a an unnecessary deep recession by radically curbing domestic demand. Kowalko, who later succeeded Balcerowicz as Minister of Finance in the post-communist government that came to power after 1993, summarized his critique in the catchy phrase of shock without therapy. Whereas Kowalko blamed Balcerowicz first and foremost for a lack of technical professionalism and was eager to present himself as a better therapist, Kowalik broadly subscribed to Balcerowicz's self-image as a disinterested and impartial expert, but accused him of an ideologically biased approach and a blind belief in neoliberal doctrine. In his opinion, the Balcerowicz plan did not introduce to Poland capitalism in general, but the worst version of it, the trademark of which became permanent mass unemployment, one of the highest income disparities, and the dismantlement of the welfare system. It is especially this picture of the Balcerowicz plan that has recently gained support amongst younger leftists taking a critical stance towards neoliberal hegemony. On the other side of the political spectrum, 19-year-old economist Witold Kierzun has grown into the role of a guru of right-wing criticism of shock therapy. For him, shock therapy has been implemented in a cruel and scandalous way, not because of the social hardships deployed by left-wing critics. Quite the contrary. Kierzun proudly mentioned that he himself had proposed a reform package aimed at the emergence of an army of unemployed to Gierek back in 1972. Instead, he condemns Balcerowicz as the destroyer of the Polish economy because he and his followers allowed for the hasty reduction of customs barriers and the sellout or even theft of national assets by Western capitalists. So, in Kierzun's account, the incompetence and corruption amongst responsible Polish authorities and officials turned Poland into a neo-colony suffering from economic occupation. This story of neo-colonization evidently resonates very well with the post-colonial image of Poland as a constant victim of the imperialist appetites of both Russia and Germany, which is cultivated amongst right-wing intellectuals and prominently voiced by Jarosław Kaczynski, the leader of the Right and Justice Party. The recolonization strategy announced by the current peace government, which materialized, for example, in the takeover of PKO SA, the second biggest Polish bank, by a state-controlled insurance company, can be seen as a direct answer to this view of post-socialist transformation. There is, however, a second major current of right-wing attacks on the liberal transformation elites that is more closely linked to the dark moods of the Round Table Agreement. Not only did the liberals allow for the purported sellout of Polish industry to foreign capitalists, but also for the enrichment of former communist nomenclatura members with whom they had compromised at the Round Table. This accusation had been raised already contemporarily, for example, in an infamous article by Jacek Kurski in 1990. For Kurski, shock therapy was a failure primarily because it did not do away with former nomenclatura members still occupying the commanding posts in the economy. This view was highly instrumental in political struggle then, as Jarosław Kaczynski framed his political program as an attempt to direct ordinary people's anger against nomenclatura networks. Thus, the idea of obscure elite networks, in Polish układ, dominating both the newly established state and the economy, turned into a cornerstone of right-wing discourse on Polish transformation. At first glance, it seems difficult to accommodate the notion of a far-reaching elite continuity between communist Poland and the post-1989 Third Republic with the demonization of the Balcerowicz shock therapy. It is somewhat contradictory to claim on the one hand that nothing really changed because the liberals colluded with the communists, and to denounce the Balcerowicz plan on the other hand for brutally changing everything for worse. Similar, it does not really make sense to reject both foreign takeovers and nomenclatura capitalism. As post-socialist Poland started with an evident lack of domestic capital, it was clear that a big bang approach to transformation would favor outsiders, including foreign investors, whereas a more gradual therapy would ensure a better start for insiders, namely technical and economic elites, whose careers had usually been in one or the other way entangled with the state socialist system before. Although such contradictions are only superficially bridged by the central ideas of betrayal and theft, the right-wing narrative has proven credible enough to address the anti-elitist ressentiments that grew out of the social frustrations of transformation. Nonetheless, right-wing references in post-socialist economic transformation are in practice more interested in anti-communist symbolism than in really engaging with core issues of the economic and social regime established by Balcerowicz and his followers. While the Balcerowicz shock therapy looms large in all mainstream narrations of Polish economic transformation, irrespective of their political background, I think it is important to remind us of the obvious fact that Poland's economic transformation did not begin with Balcerowicz, nor did it end with his macroeconomic liberalization package. In fact, the building of Polish capitalism started even earlier than political transformation. Notably, the last communist government, led by Mieczysław Rakowski, was already clearly committed to far-reaching economic liberalization. Economic historian Andrzej Zawistowski stated for good reasons that communist Poland had come to an end in economic terms on January the 1st, 1989, when the so-called Wilczek laws legalized nearly all kinds of private economic activities. Again, key controversial steps of the transformation process, like the privatization of state-owned industry, were not included in the Balcerowicz plan. Indeed, radical neoliberals even criticized Balcerowicz for not sufficiently pushing for quick privatization. Unlike in the former DDR, where a ready-made social economic system and management know-how was simply imported from West Germany, Polish debates over the right way to large-scale privatization lasted for years, not to mention its implementation. So, instead of radical shock therapy, it is rather the protracted character of the Polish way to capitalism that can be considered its trademark. Moreover, if one takes a closer look at the fierce controversy over the Balcerowicz plan and its possible alternatives, differences turn out to be less fundamental than they appear at first glance. Even Ryszard Bugaj, a pronounced opponent of Balcerowicz, concedes that the first part of stabilization measures he would have taken if he would have been in his place would have looked very much the same. Recently, economist Martin Pionkowski has downplayed the antagonism around gradualists versus Big Bang approaches. In his view, macroeconomic stabilization had to be achieved as quick as possible, while institution building and privatization took their time for objective reasons. Although Pionkowski writes about post-socialist Poland as Europe's growth champion in a way that at times comes close to a theodicy style, a best of all world style, he acknowledges that the sources of this success story were diverse. Notably, he argues, along with other authors, that delayed privatization should not be seen as a major weakness of Polish transformation, as Balcerowicz and other liberals assumed, but contributed to its outcomes in a positive way. Irrespective of whether one would evaluate the overall balance sheet of Polish transformation as success or failure, it does not make much sense to make Balcerowicz responsible for all the achievements or all the illnesses of post-socialist Polish economy. After all, it was simply not him who took all the relevant decisions, nor did he take them autonomously from both domestic and international influence. This insight seems to be at least partly eclipsed by the immense political and emotional load that has become attached to the Balcerowicz plan in Polish public memory. Yet, the current state of positive or negative mythologization has to quite some extent been influenced by Balcerowicz's own self-portrayal and communication strategy.
Did you conclude now?
Yeah, I come to a conclusion, yeah. From the beginning of his political career in August 1989, he has presented himself as a non-partisan expert working hard from dusk till dawn to rescue the Polish economy. And until today, he continues to stylize himself as an unerring fighter for economic freedom who calls on his compatriots to join in the struggle. I have it here. Yeah. In his public statements, Balcerowicz presents his own reasoning, which is often based on highly idealized models and never sufficiently reflecting reality, as the only rational approach to economic problems, and denounces every dissenting voice as overly emotional. For instance, He rejects any positive notion of social, national, or just common as a dangerous symptom of emotionalist collectivism stemming from the times when people lived in hordes of hunters and gatherers. The persistence of such positioning, which might be rather called paleo-liberal than neoliberal, suggests that the worldview of Balcerowicz and the segment of transformation liberals he is part of has been shaped not so much by creative appropriation and adaptation of Western ideas, but by a primarily mimetic approach. Their wholehearted adoption of neoliberalism, as well as their unconditional readiness to accept even the toughest reform proposals presented by EMF advisors, and their obstinate emphasis on catching up with the West, add up to what Richard Bugaj criticized as aping the West. And yet, Bugaj and other left-wing critics of shock therapy, such as Karol Modzelewski, also admitted that this approach found wide support also amongst ordinary Poles, who were no less fascinated by Western lifestyle and affluence then. These aspirations were not limited to material well-being, but included the desire to join the Western world, which at the time was plainly perceived as the realm of the normal. Taking this into account, the symbolic dimensions of Polish memory struggles over shock therapy cannot be explained solely by its dramatic economic and social consequences, but have to be seen in the context of quarrels over the self-image of Poles vis-à-vis the West as well. To sum up, the extraordinary position occupied by Leszek Balcerowicz and macroeconomic shock therapy in Polish memory debates exceeds by far their political and economic relevance. It refers in large part to their crucial role in constituting the vocabulary of talking and indeed of thinking about the economic realm in the decades to come. Although the Balcerowicz plan was neither the first nor the last important step on the way from planned to market economy, it constituted the symbolic caesura that came to be identified with a new start with capitalism. As such, it became associated with the desired return to normality, but also with the definite burial of other older hopes for workers' participation, empowerment, and solidarity. As the widespread expectations of a successful life instead of a simulated one did not materialize for everyone, at least not to the same degree, it came at no surprise that disappointment and feelings of betrayal were directed against those who had promised it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this very interesting paper on the kind of polarization of the memory over Poland's economic transformation. We've gone a little bit over time, so I think we'll move straight on to the next paper, which is going to be delivered by Muriel Blaive, who is currently a researcher at the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes, but I'm sure, as many of you know, has a sort of distinguished career dealing with many different topics from 56 to 89, European memory, memories of the way in which anti-communist memory has developed, Holocaust memory, and so on. Today she's going to talk about the way in which dissent has been understood and contested in Czechoslovakia and then Czech Republic.
Thank you, James, for the kind words. Actually, I changed the title of my presentation to The Ethical Dilemmas of the Velvet Revolution, and I will explain at the very end why. So in the last years, we have witnessed the premises of a momentous renewal in the interpretation of the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. For a long time, 1989 was naturally understood as a rupture. The exit from communism has doubtless been a political, institutional, and macroeconomic success. But there is equally little doubt that the population living in the post-communist countries has been partly, at times massively, dissatisfied with certain aspects of the change, particularly with the growth of poverty and inequality and the loss of social security. Moreover, the scale of high-profile corruption, as well as the sense of impunity, has rivaled and in fact outperformed the worst successes of communism. In Poland and Hungary, because the 1989 changes were long negotiated, it is relatively easy to figure out whom to blame, and that is both partners in the discussion. But what the historiography has long neglected to see is that the Velvet Revolution, that was in all appearance an intellectual delight led by heroic dissidents, was no ideal model either. So my presentation will reflect the latest trends in Czech historiography that have become much more critical, albeit always respectful of Václav Havel's role before, during, and after the Velvet Revolution. Havel, it is now underlined, was skeptical about democracy long before 1989, and he even argued in the 1980s for post-democracy. During the Velvet Revolution, he and other dissidents played a power game quite distant from the ethical standards he has been known and esteemed for. The communist-elected parliament, in particular, was treated with an alarming level of disdain and submitted to a less than noble political intent, remove a rival from the race of the presidency, namely Alexander Dubček, the former hero of the Prague Spring. Pundits were surprised at these developments, but rarely endeavored to historicize the Velvet Revolution itself as a factor of explanation, and so this is why what I will attempt to do in this presentation. There is little doubt that the dissidents were very amateurish when it came to power politics, and it can hardly come as a surprise, nor can they be blamed for it, really. They cannot be blamed for their lack of experience. At the second round of the round tables between the government and the opposition on 28th of November, Prime Minister Adamec proposed that Civic Forum, that Havel was leading, give the list of ministers they wanted to see in the new government. However, Civic Forum had no such list, as they came completely unprepared. Adamec then announced that he would create a government made of experts, including of economic experts. On round 3, Havel accepted this experts government, but was once again incapable of communicating a list of ministers when he was prompted. On round 4, Adamec demanded for the third time a list of ministers, and this time Havel proposed Vladimir Dlouhý for the Ministry of Economic Affairs, that is none other than a communist. That the dissidents were amateurish was understandable, but the way they handled the argument that they represented the people's will is problematic. Havel insisted at every round of negotiations that the people were getting impatient and that even the Civic Forum might soon get overturned by the mob. It is, in fact, the communists who played the legality card and repeatedly insisted on following due procedure and the rule of law. The paradox in having the communists being stauncher supporter of the rule of law than the dissidents turned into a frankly absurd situation when the question of the voting system for the new president arose. It is once again the communists who were in favor of the more democratic mode, that is, a direct election by the people, rather than an indirect election by the parliament. The communists, indeed, counted on their genuine support among the population to have the communist candidate, outgoing Prime Minister Adamec, elected. For sure, this communist certainty is a snapshot of that particular instant that does not take into account the dynamic of power and popularity that would dramatically evolve in just a few weeks, not to mention they didn't take into account the international context. Nevertheless, it does speak volumes as to the unpopularity of the dissidents at the time of the revolution and as to the level of popular legitimacy that the regime still enjoyed. The dissidents were claiming to represent the will of the people, but were so insecure as to Havel's chances of winning free elections that they found themselves arguing in favor of keeping the election of the president by the communist-elected parliament in the name of stability. We doubtlessly bump here into one of the first sins, so to speak, of the Velvet Revolution. That is, that the dissidents actually needed the communist government to validate, despite the latter's best interests, their claim that it was the dissidents who were the legitimate representatives of the people. In effect, the dissidents actively bypassed the public opinion in order to get Havel elected, so he could represent this public opinion allegedly better than the communist candidate. This disregard for the reality on the ground and the means enforced to ensure this validation are problematic from an ethical point of view. It is no wonder, as historian Jiří Suk remarks, that many began to speak of a velvet hangover in the 1990s. The unease does not stop here, as the continuity with past practices continued surfacing. The constitutional lawyer who endeavored on 29th of November 1989 to have the parliament erase the 3 articles from the Czechoslovak constitution that guaranteed the leading role of the Communist Party was none other than the author of this very same communist constitution in 1960. His name was Zdeněk Jičínský. Why was he chosen? Because during normalization, he had become a dissident and Charter 77 signatory. Jičínský is also the author of the proposal on 28th of November to have a number of the communist-elected parliamentary members revoked by the political groups for abusing their mandate and not minding the will and interest of the people, and to co-opt new ones in their places. As Jerzy Suk again remarks, there lies a troubling symmetry with past practices, since after the Warsaw Pact invasion, in 1969, it is the very same Juczynski who had then participated in the purges of the reformed Dubčekian MPs along the very same argumentation. But was it even possible for the dissidents to choose anything but this cautious strategy? Michał Żantowski rightfully reminds us that the Civic Forum had only in mind to minimize the risk of violence, a violence that Czech culture famously abhors. Yet Kieran Williams reminds us of other troubling similarities with past practices. For instance, 3 institutions were established to deal with the Ministry of the Interior that comprised the famous or the infamous secret police, the STB, and its archives. One of those institutions was a network of 3-man screening commissions that were that was created on 7th of February 1990. Each of those troikas consisted of 1 former STB officer discharged after 1968 for having supported the liberalization, 1 member of a citizens' committee, and 1 current employee of the ministry. Such a network of vigilant citizens and of 3-man screening commissions was once again eerily reminiscent of the action committees that had stormed the country after the February 48 communist takeover and had served to fire from their positions all citizens who were not vocally committed to the nascent communist dictatorship. Moreover, the chaos and incompetence that accompanied the dismissal of STB officers was made worse by the fact that these policemen received millions of crowns in compensation for their premature dismissals. All lump sum payments to secret police officers were made immediately. Some victims believed that their former oppressors were once again profiting at their expense. To add insult to injury, the victims compared themselves unfavorably not only with the former policemen, but with their new rivals, that is, high-profile dissidents, such as Charter 77 signatories and Prague Spring leaders, who, as one interviewee put it, got fame, return of property, high salaries, and especially power after 1989. In the words of Roman David, the political prisoners thus lost this competition for social acknowledgement to the dissidents as a result of the way in which the revolution unfolded. In short, the premium set on continuity and on the disarming of any potential violence in 1989 would be paid dearly later on in terms of the popularity or even legitimacy of the post-communist regime. To top it all off, suspicions rapidly surrounded the new Minister of the Interior, Richard Sacher, who was Havel's choice, for keeping the head of the STB, General Lawrence, in place for several weeks. This resulted in the destruction of the live files of the STB and seriously hampered the transitional justice in dealing with the communist past in the 1990s. So the communist regime did fall, and the dissidents did become the new political elite, but the secret police negotiated remarkably favorable conditions for its decommissioning, due in part to the dissidents' incompetence and lack of experience, in part to their compromises with their own ethical standards in order to ensure the success of the revolution, and in part to their caution not to destroy the ranks of the new elites by unleashing too strict a transitional justice process. The credibility of the new post-communist regime was in question before the revolution was even over. While this did not seem to matter so much in the euphoria of the first years, these shortcomings would come back to gravely haunt the Czech Republic. This year, 30 years later, President Zeman has already announced that he will not take part in any celebration of the Velvet Revolution, while Prime Minister Babiš announced that he will be abroad that day. The revolution has become simply impossible to celebrate at the head of the Czech state. A more detailed point I want to make now is the way in which the parliament was treated. That was, yet again, not a good omen. Michał Żantowski claims that the presidential election was settled between Havel and Chalfa, the prime minister, on 15th of December, and adds with his customary humor, I'm quoting, "To anyone wondering how the vote of a parliament of 2 chambers and 350 deputies could be settled beforehand in the meeting of 2 men, neither of whom was an MP, suffice it to say that this was a parliament so used to taking orders, it would have elected Dracula if told to do so by the government. With a specter of hundreds of thousands of people marching at its gates, there was never a risk of its mustering a mind of its own," unquote. This account might be entertaining, But it is an ex post facto reconstruction dating from 2012 and is very much contradicted by old and new research. Indeed, according to historian Jerzy Suk, the MPs, the communist MPs, were in reality firmly determined to resist the pressure from under and from above, to engage themselves fully in the democratic process, and to gain greater social recognition for their role. On 13th of December 1989, they endorsed the resignation of a few apparatchiks in their midst, elected a new presidium, and declared their intention to have the new president elected directly by the people. Indeed, it would have been a more democratic process, they thought, since it would have allowed to have more candidates. Mainly, it would have been a greater moral satisfaction for them than to be humiliated into electing Havel before being discarded and purged, which is what they knew was awaiting them in January, since Jinczynski was already preparing the purges. As mentioned above, Havel mobilized the fear of the masses, and by so doing, he hit upon a major and insolvable contradiction. How far could the democratic revolution go in terms of authoritarian practices? The Velvet Revolution had found its limits, in the words of Jerzy Suk. The revolutionary constitutionalists, Zdeněk Jičinský, Pavel Rychecki, and Petr Pithard, publicly disavowed a direct election and pleaded for constitutional continuity and continuity of practices in quite amazing terms. They accused the communist MPs, I'm quoting Suk, they accused the communist MPs of disregard for the existing constitutional order and traditions, and they applied normative pressure by calling defiant MPs helpers of the devil. They intimated that the only way for the MPs to redeem themselves was to elect Havel president and to adopt the new constitutional order, on the basis of which many would be soon dismissed. Unsurprisingly, the MPs continued holding on to their own interpretation of the rule of law. As Suk states it, I'm quoting again, in the name of a radiant democratic future, the MPs who had indeed been elected undemocratically, but who were now professing to respect democracy, were forced to adopt non-democratic practices. Far from spotting in their own attitude a troubling air of déjà vu dating from 1948, the Velvet Revolutionaries did not acknowledge in the situation any moral dilemma, since they despised the MPs as corrupt servants of the totalitarian regime.
4 minutes, Muriel.
Yeah, it gets worse. Suk reports that according to Jerzy Svoboda, upcoming president of the Czech and Moravian Communist Party, several communist MPs refused to endorse this arrangement and planned to demonstratively resign from their mandate, thereby safeguarding their personal and communist honor. In view of this impending fiasco, a meeting of the parliamentary club of the communist MPs was called on 27th of December. Secretary Vasil Mohorita and Prime Minister Marian Chalfa, himself a communist but now committed to the revolution, threatened them with a criminalization of their political attitudes and with hangings on the lampposts. The MPs were made to vote again and again until they reached unanimity, says Svoboda. Chalfa, quoted by Suk, later acknowledged that he had been, quote, very brutal, unquote. 2 days later, on 29th of December, Havel was unanimously elected Czechoslovak president at the Prague castle. Jerzy Suk finally notes that if the positions of many communist MPs were indeed redistributed in January, they tended to favor Czech MPs rather than Slovak. And Petr Roubal shows that the Slovaks were soon indignant at these redistributions. This imbalance looked harmless in view of the overall success of the revolution and downfall of the communist regime, but it would soon come back and become toxic for the fresh post-communist federation. All the more so that the adoption of new rules faithfully provided a blocking minority for important laws to as little as 31 deputies. I cannot help thinking that this concession was made to the Slovaks with the condescending view that would be happy with it and stop making problems. So, in conclusion, and if I summarize, democracy was ridiculed at least 3 times by having Havel elected by the Communist Parliament, by turning down the direct election of the president by the people in the name of stability at the time of an alleged popular revolution, and by purging the deputies in a process worthy of communist practices. The support of workers was ensured thanks to false promises, such as the promise that there would be no unemployment and no harsh economic measures. And Slovaks were treated with contempt, all the while bestowing upon them the gift of the blocking minority tool, which were, of course, put to use since they not wrongly felt disenfranchised. The fear of what the masses could do was mobilized. The MPs were intimidated. Communist authorities were left free to tamper with the secret police files. And as to outvote the Slovak reform communists, it is the economists that were co-opted and given free rein. Any scenario for exiting communism would have led to its own disastrous effects, and this one was no exception. The latest research shows beyond a doubt that despite the image of rupture conveyed by the term revolution, the continuities in institutions, in behavior, and in personnel were very important. The Velvet Revolution clearly revealed a paradox. It is impossible to get rid of a dictatorship with democratic means, and it is impossible to start a democracy on dictatorship practices. The insistence on legality was a killer, but the non-insistence would have also been a killer and would have been an original sin of another type. Think of Romania. There was, and there could have been, no good solution, which is doubtlessly why we're still mired in post-communism 30 years later. And my very last point, I'm very grateful to Veronica and Joanna for having introduced the term economy in the title of this conference, as it got me thinking. I realized, thanks to them, that the economic transition introduced in Czechoslovakia was in fact very much linked to the course taken by the revolution itself. Because I had to take a huge detour now, by explaining to you how this revolution happened, I have no more time to develop what is in my mind, my main point, in fact, that both the co-opting of economists such as Václav Klaus, who would later become the father of the Czechoslovak economic transition, and the pushing out of the Slovaks as a potential reform communist or even social democratic alternative to putting the Czech dissidents to power, that would soon result in the breakup of the country. But both these events have everything to do with what I've just described. That is that the issue is the fundamental problem of the lack of representativity of the dissidents, who, in the name of the superior goal of democracy, were led to take many liberties with it. The direct affiliation of the economic and political transition with this situation will have to be the topic of a further talk, but I hope I have at least laid the necessary basis. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you very much for a very revisionist history of dissidence and its effects on the Velvet Revolution. Very striking. So our final speaker on this panel is Wolf-Rüdiger Knoll, who is a PhD student at the same institution as Florian at the Institute of Contemporary History in Berlin, and he's working on a wider research project on the economic transformation of East Germany in the early 1990s, and he's going to talk specifically today about a topic which is, I guess, right at the center of our interest, the ways in which East Germans remember the Treuhand, the institution that privatized a lot of the East German economy.
Thank you. Yeah, well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference to giving me the opportunity to, say something about the most controversial institution of economic transformation in East Germany. And this institution is was called Treuhandanstalt, or in short form like Treuhand. And what I would like to do is that I would like to focus on three aspects. First, I'd like to talk about the founding and the establishment of the Treuhand. Second, I will say something about the function in the transformation process of East German economy. And last but not least, I will focus on the legacy of the Treuhand in the collective memory of reunified Germany. So, first, in the summer and autumn of 1989, developments in neighboring socialist countries, such as Poland and Hungary as well, as the changed geopolitical preferences of the Soviet Union led to a mass exodus of German Democratic Republic citizens and to civil protests, which finally allowed a peaceful revolution. In Germany, that peaceful revolution became popular with the German term Wende. Characteristics of this peaceful revolution were the dismissal of the old state and party leadership, as well as the erosion of the surveillance apparatus. The fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1989 is generally seen as the highlight of this period of change. With the opening of state borders to the Federal Republic of Germany, the question of the future coexistence of two German states arose. In the month following the fall of the Berlin Wall, public debates were also dominated by disputes over the future economic order in East Germany. In the GDR, German Democratic Republic, all companies with more than 10 employees were fully integrated into the system of the socialist planned economy, at least since 1972. They were called people-owned enterprises. In fact, they were owned by the state. People-owned enterprises in German short form is VEB. However, the introduction of free market principles based on the West German model would also mean a retreat of state ownership of these businesses. After all, at the beginning of 1990, there were more than 8,500 VEBs with about 4 million employees. Even though the Socialist Party had to share power with opposition groups, she was in charge of converting state property into private ownership structures. For this purpose, the GDR Council of Ministers decided to found an Institution for the Fiduciary Administration of Public Property on the 1st of March 1990. In other words, this was called Treuhandanstalt, Treuhand, or if we use an English term that fits better, is like a trustee agency, trust agency. The basic idea of the trust law was to guarantee rights to East German citizens as they were shareholders of public property. The process was supposed to be organized similar to the privatization in Czechoslovakia, where citizens received a share of the public property, what we know as coupon privatization. Anyway, in the end, the coupon privatization did not become a mandatory part of this first Treuhand law. The Treuhand began its work in mid-March 1990. At the time of its founding, it was the largest holding in the world. The main task of the first employees, who were East Germans and, who basically worked before in the ministries of economic and finance in the GDR, the task of these employees was to unbundle business conglomerates and to convert state-owned enterprises in corporations. That happened until the mid of 1990. At this time, the agency had just 143 employees. A significant change in its mission and its work happened to the Treuhand in the summer of 1990. The first free elections in the GDR led to a new government which sought a quick reunification with West Germany. On the 7th of June 1990, therefore, an amendment to the law was made on the basis of negotiations between representatives of both states on economic, monetary, and social union. The first section of this law, I will quote that one, "The national assets are to be privatized." The second section of the law referred in particular to the model of the social market economy, a term that represented the economic structure of West Germany since the 1950s. And as says there, the Treuhand is a public law institution. It serves the privatization and utilization of national wealth according to the principles of the social market economy. That way, the core task of the Treuhand was transformed. From now on, it was determined to privatize the assets owned by the state. The privatization revenues should be used as contributions to the state budget and to cover current expenses of the Treuhand. The law did not give the East German citizens the right to gain profits from the transformation. At that time, the trustee agency still expected to earn some 600 billion Deutsche Mark by selling profitable businesses to private investors. This optimistic evaluation was based on assessments of the performance and competitiveness of the East German companies, but based on different currencies. Although there was no official exchange rate between West and East German currency, the two countries agreed to an exchange value in domestic trade of something like 1 to 5. So 1 West German Deutsche Mark would match 5 East German Mark. That was in 1989. The East German Ministry of Economic Affairs already recognized that the introduction of the Deutsche Mark in East Germany, which was decided on the 1st of July 1990, would pose considerable problems. A rating of 2,600 companies showed that only about 1/3 would be profitable and would not need financial support. 27% of the companies were rated as reorganization cases operating at a financial loss. In the view of the ministry, 40% were even threatened by bankruptcy. Particularly problematic was the exchange of wages at a ratio of 1 to 1 in the course of the monetary union. Where East German companies had benefited from low labor costs, when exporting to the Western countries in particular, the introduction of the Deutsche Mark now led to a suddenly worsened competitiveness. Labor productivity was significantly lower than in the West, but the high wages at the same time made the products considerably more expensive. The decision to introduce the Deutsche Mark in East Germany in the course of reunification was largely based on political considerations. It was supposed to prevent another mass migration of East Germans into the Federal Republic of Germany. A slogan that became very popular in the aftermath of reunification shows the demands of the East German population for a strong currency and a good pay. In German it says, kommt die D-Mark, bleiben wir, kommt sie nicht, gehen wir zu ihr. So if I translate, it would mean something like, if the Deutsche Mark comes to East Germany, we stay, but if the Deutsche Mark stays in West Germany, we come to have it there. The introduction of the Deutsche Mark was a significant challenge to the work of the Treuhand, which began its work as privatization authority in the late summer of 1990. Come to my second point, the trust and its position in the course of the transformation of East German economy. In August 1990, the West German steel manager Detlef Carsten Rohwedder became president of the Treuhand. Rohwedder started a promotion campaign in West Germany to find much needed senior employees and suitable staff. In addition to the headquarters, which was based at Berlin's Alexanderplatz, there were 15 branches in the former district towns of the GDR, which were entrusted with the privatization of small and medium-sized companies up to 1,000 employees. The headquarters took care of the privatization of the larger companies with a maximum of 15,000 employees. The leading functions of the Treuhand were at that time almost without exception occupied by West German staff. The first privatization activities actually happened before reunification. In these early cases, leading West German companies took over East Germany's electricity, banking, and insurance businesses. From October 1990, the sale of the highly valuated businesses to West German investors began, some of which had entered joint ventures with East German companies after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but decided to take over the businesses completely after the monetary union. As a result of the legal security since the 3rd of October 1990, the first sales were announced immediately thereafter. In the federal state of Brandenburg, for instance, BASF, huge chemical business, purchased in Schwarzheide a chemical plant for just 5 million Deutsche Mark, but at the same time promised to invest over 600 million over the next few years. Mercedes-Benz took over the truck production south of Berlin. Krupp Steel took over a steel mill north of Berlin. All this happened even before the newly elected state governments were able to begin their work. At the same time, the first major closures of companies took place in autumn 1990. The well-known Dresden-based camera manufacturer Pentacon was closed, as well as a large chemical fiber producer in Brandenburg. Treuhand President Rohwedder commented on its closure with the words, "Well, it's just doomed to die." Also, the companies which were sold did not keep all employees. Numerous jobs were eliminated by rationalization, hard word, and technologization. BASF in Schwarzheide reduced its core workforce from 5,000 to 2,000 people within 2 years. In the Schwedt oil processing plant, which was sold to a West German energy consortium, the workforce was reduced from formerly 8,500 employees to around 2,000. Just within 3 years after the privatization. One of the first major company closures that created extensive media coverage was the case of the East German airline Interflug. After Lufthansa had taken over parts of the maintenance facilities, politics and entrepreneurs showed no interest in another competitor in the German air traffic. For this reason, the Federal Ministry of Economics rejected an offer by British Airways. Finally, the Interflug was liquidated in 1991. Since early 1991, the massive job losses and the rapid decline of the industrial capacity of the East German economy led to protests against the work of the Treuhand and its leadership. According to President Rohwedder, demands for a stronger focus on the restructuring of the enterprises were answered with the words, I quote, "Privatization is the most effective reorganization." On April the 1st, 1991, Rohwedder was shot. Even before Rohwedder's death, the Treuhand agreed with the federal government and the East German state governments on a better cooperation. So-called Treuhand cabinets were set up and the flow of information was significantly improved. This subsequent participation of the new East German federal states did not detract from the actual work of the Treuhand. Under Rohwedder's successor, Birgit Breuil, the pace of sales and shutdowns was once again significantly increased. In 1992, there were hundreds of privatizations a month. The authority grew to more than 4,000 employees. The Treuhand officially ended their activity, or its activity, on the 31st of December 1994. As a result, it can be said that in 1993, East German industry produced only a third of its 1989 level. Of 4 million jobs, only 1 million remained in 1994. 80% of all businesses were sold to West German investors, 15% to foreign investors. Only 5% of the companies went into East German ownership. Instead of a profit, the authority left a debt of 250 billion Deutsche Mark, which consisted mainly of old debts, loans, and restructuring expenses. Only 40 billion Deutsche Mark could be earned through corporate sales. At the end of the Treuhand activity, the authority that understood itself as a privatization agency became the, again a quote, best hated institution of reunified Germany. And this brings me to, well, the last point, last but not least, the Treuhand and its legacy in the collective memory of reunified Germany. Already during its work, the trustee agency Treuhand has been described as an, quote, omnipotent colonization authority by critics, as a state in a state, or, like former Chancellor Helmut Schmidt mentioned it, as an additional powerful East German government. While the seat of the federal government remained in Bonn until 1998, the headquarters of the Treuhand was in Berlin, and thus in the heart of East Germany. There were numerous demonstrations against layoffs, factory closures, and rising unemployment rates. Officially, these unemployment rates in East Germany reached its peak with just under 20% in 1992. In fact, measurements such as short-time working, the support of training, and early retirement at the age of 55 had helped to cover real unemployment rates that reached up to 50% in some regions of East Germany. While Helmut Kohl is still perceived as the Chancellor of Unity in East Germany, or in Germany overall, and praised for his foreign policy successes in 1990, the promise of so-called blooming landscapes by Helmut Kohl in East Germany, given by him is a veritable shadow on Kohl's biography, because his vision did not become reality. Instead, the East German economy deteriorated. Its slow performance was closely linked to the activities of the Treuhand, especially in the minds of the former citizens of the GDR. Various narratives determined the perception of the Treuhand even after its official end. This perception ranges from a so-called neo-patriotic success story, as represented by the then Federal Finance Minister Theo Weigel until today, to an so-called capitalist nightmare, as argumented by representatives of the political opposition, workers' representatives, and trade unions. The massive criticism of the Treuhand was intensified through scandalous cases, which partly came along with white-collar crime that created even more bad publicity. The result was an image of a wiping out authority which led East German companies to the edge of existence in order to sell them to West German investors at dumping prices. Considering this, it was not surprising that a political trick was needed to remove the Treuhand from the public crossfire. The end of the authority's activities was officially announced as for New Year's Eve 1994. In fact, it was given the cumbersome name Bundesvereinigung für vereinigungsbedingte Sonderaufgaben and continued its work out of media attention until the early 2000s. At the interface between state, economy, and society, the Treuhand served as a buffer between elected leaders who pointed to the agency when pinpointing responsibility for the consequences of the privatization, and the East Germans who blamed the agency for mass redundancies and liquidations of companies. As the only East German authority which also existed after reunification, it was always subordinated to the Federal Ministry of Finance and therefore realized the political will of the federal government. In that way, the Treuhand became a public institution with a shock absorber function. Moreover, it worked as some kind of lightning rod for East German people in order to express their disappointment about the economic misery and unfulfilled expectations. The Treuhand became a kind of negative founding myth of the Berlin Republic.
3 minutes.
All right, yeah, perfect. In the 1990s and 2000s, the trustee agency disappeared from public debates. But in East Germany, it maintained its image of a somehow criminal deindustrialization authority. According to a survey in the cities of Eisenach and Leipzig in 2017, the most common term associated with the Treuhand is, or was, liquidation. This is followed by sellout and fraud. To this day, Treuhand is the negative reminder of the unification society of the early 1990s. It is considered a prime example of the incorporation model, of thus the failed attempt of reunification on eye level. In a specific East German culture of remembrance, the Treuhand still represents a crystallization point for disappointed hopes of the early 1990s. That way, unprocessed experiences were somehow mentally outsourced into a, well, so-called bad bank of transformation. However, this evaluation is tied to the generation directly affected by the activities of the Treuhand. Subsequent generations are mostly neutral to the term Treuhand or do not have the necessary knowledge to assess this traumatizing institution. This traumatizing institution is more common or more known for the East German so-called Wende generation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for a paper which deals with a very important topic. I've been asked to say a few words. I have to be chair and discussant, so I could speak forever, but I'm not going to. You've heard enough of me today. But I just have a few points I would like to raise that maybe bring the papers together. And so my first question is about writing this type of revisionist histories, because in some ways you're all dealing with some kind of revisionist thinking about 1989, which doesn't talk about breakthrough, talks about continuity, talks about perceptions of colonialism, talks about ideas that it was a stolen revolution in some way. And of course, you know, there's a political context to this in which populist movements, actually both of the right and the left, mobilize these kinds of stories politically. So my question is, how do we deal with this as historians? And I think I ask this because it came up with our book as well. We realized we were writing interpretations that could be politically mobilized in ways that we were uncomfortable with. So how do you deal with that in your work? And I think that brings together the kind of historical work versus memory question well. My second point is about the authoritarian 1989, let's put it that way. That a number of you, well, Muriel talks of, I mean, it's very striking revisionist histories of dissidents in which, and I think the part of the paper that I read that you didn't talk about was the kind of lack of discussion about democracy amongst late Czech dissident movements, the authoritarian cultures within, and also the anti-Slovak nature of that Czech dissidence. I mean, maybe it's very strikingly that Charter 77 was not translated into Slovak. And that all these things then get played out in 1989 in ways that you, as you sort of say, betray some of the values of the revolution. In terms of Balcerowicz, I mean, he very much, as you said, I mean, saw himself as a kind of technocratic figure above politics almost. And I know in some of his writing from the early 1990s, he says, well, you know, you have to have democracy. Of course, that's about human dignity, but that's not so important. Really, what we have to do is stand above politics and do this from above. So there is a kind of authoritarian moment around 89 that's being picked up in a number. And of course, I mean, the Treuhand is in many ways an authoritarian reaching to the east. So what is it about that moment that makes it also authoritarian in some ways? I mean, I know Michal Kopeček's project in Prague is talking about these kind of very elitist, technocratic managerial cultures of late socialism and the way they feed in. We might also think about neoliberal authoritarianism in the West. I just wonder if you could reflect on that. My third point is about resistance, and some of you give examples of resistance, although it seems to me comparatively, if we look to other regions that resisted, say, the Washington Consensus, if we want to call it that way, neoliberalism, Latin America or Africa, firstly, there are much lower levels of resistance in Eastern Europe generally. And why is that? And when we do have instances of resistance, as we obviously do for the Treuhand, and obviously in the early 1990s we have some in Poland, why is it generally not successful? Would you say it was not successful? And why can it not mobilize? The fourth point about colonialism, and I was very struck in the papers that, I mean, despite a very powerful narrative of colonialism and Western colonialism, actually there's relatively little foreign investment from outside the region in the early years. I got from these papers, which is quite striking to me. And they made me also think of a very interesting book from last year or the year before, Besnik Pula, Globalization Under and After Socialism. So thinking about the globalizing economic forms of late socialism, and I think, he argues that those countries that have the most foreign direct investment under socialism then integrate best in the 1990s, but I suspect these cases are the opposite of what he's arguing. Final point about continuity versus breakthrough, which I suppose will be a theme quite constant through this conference. And so Muriel brought up this Jaczynski, so this legal scholar who'd been involved in the 1960 Constitution, then is brought back in 89. And we found in our 89 book, there are so many of these legal figures who sort of exist in this kind of grey zone between the party and dissidents, who then become very prominent figures around 1989, and then become the target of populists later on, who say, they were the ones ensuring forms of legal continuity and no breakthrough. So I was interested in exactly this legacy of late socialism, but then I would extend it to these two papers on economics, and you sort of start in 89 as a kind of breakthrough story. So I'm kind of wondering about the origins of some of the decisions that were made in the early 1990s. Can you see it in debates in the 1980s? Where does the Treuhand idea come from? Is it debated in the 70s and 80s in West Germany? Okay, anyway, these are my questions. I don't know if you want to answer any of those or whether we also throw it open to the floor. What do you...
I may... I don't know. If we have time, I may, of course, try to answer some of the points because these are really, very important points. Actually, I also have been actually thinking about, and maybe I say one or two words to the first point you brought up. What is the role of us historians in this, or in this actually, minefield of memory over this transformation? And my point would be to make clear, or to argue that this transformation era actually is over now. I think this is a very important point to make, because as far as I see, many of the public debates are still very much in a presentist mode. If you want to have it, it's about who did things right and who did it wrong, and it's not about what were the contemporary horizons of expectancy and so on. What was the role of contingent decisions in a certain respect, and therefore I think contemporary history is actually, as far as I see, it's only moving into this field, and it's our task to historicize it in a way that makes it clear that political struggle we are experiencing now is may relate to these decisions which were taken then, but we are actually living now we have this wisdom of hindsight in a certain respect, and we shouldn't try as historians or as participants of public debates now to judge what was right and what was wrong then. It's because this is still the mode many of social science, much of the social science which is working on this period is still working, because they are looking at what are the outcomes and what could have been better, and what would have been what has been done wrong. And I think from a historical point of view, we should come over this certain point. And what I would add to this is that we also what I try to do in this paper very briefly is that we would have a look at these divergent narrations of this transformation as a field where the foundations of economic and social imaginaries have been laid and have been also negotiated in the post-socialist countries, which is of course on a next level a point of historicizing this economic and social imaginaries, actually. Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe that much.
I'll just answer 3 questions. So what about writing this type of revisionist history? How do we deal with this as historians? We don't do the mistake that political scientists do. That is, or commentators type Timothy Garton-Ash or even Krastev, who wrote really very well and very well thought pieces, but all of them start after the end of the revolution. They start figuratively in 89, but after 89 is already played out, as if you could explain what happened after 89 without knowing what happened in 1989 and before 1989. We crucially need to historicize the revolution itself. I think this has been a really fundamental mistake in the past 30 years. And as to authoritarian 1989, and could it have been otherwise? No, it couldn't, which is why, despite the fact that I'm very critical of the role of Havel, of the way the revolution played out, I'm at the same time not critical at all, because how else could they have done it? Where would they have learned a proper democratic behavior? I mean, where there was just no way. You know, like for decades already, for several generations, the communist regime had shaped the popular understanding of what is public, of the public good, and you just don't invent a fresh democratic conscience overnight. It just doesn't work. So I don't think it could have been perfect. Even in Germany, which is the only country where there was a really trained democratic Western part who could take over the process, bring the money. Even there, it didn't leave the people overly satisfied for a very long time. So I don't think it was possible to make it perfect, quite simply. Finally, the question of continuity versus breakthrough and Juczynski. Contrary to Poland and Hungary, the actors of the revolution have not been criticized yet. So there has not been this, well, there's still this myth that the revolution was a good thing, because there's only one narrative possible, and the fact that this narrative does not correspond to the reality, the only possible outcome is that people don't speak about it. So, like, the leaders are just not going to be there, as if there was no revolution to celebrate. It's kind of voting with their feet in a way, because it doesn't work. And why was there so little resistance to the changes is because people were lied to, as I said. I mean, really, the workers were taken on board with the revolution, with the promise that there would be no strong economic reforms, there would be no unemployment. That's how their support was reached. And because people were so happy, and rightfully so, that communism fell down, that the idea that there would be necessary sacrifices was really strong and was justified, and justified many abuses, in fact, but it took a very long time for people to realize it. Okay.
All right, yeah, I'd like to say something about 1989 as breakthrough story, and maybe what has that year to do with what happened before. And I think it's important to stress what happened in West Germany in particular, because well, we're talking about a situation where East Germany would enter, basically would enter the West German constitution. So East Germany would become part of the political system of West Germany, and therefore also become part of the political and economic system of West Germany. So what happened in West Germany was in the 1980s, what happened is that West Germany was influenced by the ideas of Reaganism, of Thatcherism, basically what happened in Great Britain and United States, because, so what I want to say is they were influenced by the idea of reducing the state-owned companies or the amount of the state-owned companies. In West Germany, that happened with the post service, also the rail service or the telecommunication. But at that time, in the 1980s, we talk about just one company a year, so the privatization of one company a year. And in 1990, we're talking, or 1991, 1992, we talk about, like, as I mentioned it, hundreds of privatization processes just in a month. So I think the basic idea before, and this was brought in the process of reunification, was the idea that the state cannot be a better entrepreneur than or as a private businesses. And this idea was somehow transferred into East Germany. And another thing is that East Germans wanted to have the system that existed in West Germany. East Germans wanted to buy West German products. What East Germans not wanted was was all kind of unemployment, but nobody would have mentioned it. I mean, they were talking about the letter J would show the economic development. So the J starts with going down, but then rapidly going up. You know what I mean? Yeah. Right. Okay. Sorry. It's either that way. Or yeah. Okay. So that's what I'd like to say about what happened before 1989. The other thing is that how can we deal with these topics as historians? That's kind of, as far as I'm concerned, that's kind of complicated because it depends on who you're talking to, or it depends on who you're actually addressing. If like I talk to somebody who has lost his job in the early 1990s, like in a steel mill maybe, these people would, most of the people would say, well, the Treuhand, these guys were thieves or criminals. They wanted to shut down our plant or our business, and it's very hard to get some kind of discussion, or to start some kind of discussion about the historical background and so on, because it's a very emotional topic. So as a historian, it depends, and it's also a political topic right now. I mean, in Germany, there were left-wing and also right-wing parties, which is interesting, who try to be successful in East Germany, and they wanted to start another investigation committee in the German parliament in order to do some kind of investigation about the work of the Treuhand. Again, like 25 years after, in the parliament, which is probably not a political thing, would be much more a historical thing, but these parties, they try to use the Treuhand still in order to, get some kind of votings for their purpose. So it's very difficult to deal within the current situation. Let's see how it works within the next few years. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have at least 3 questions, 4 questions, 5, okay. 6, 7, 8. Okay, this will be complicated.
Okay, thank you. Bartłomiej Krzysztof, Institute of Political Studies of Polish Academy of Sciences. So I would start with a comment to the remark with Muriel did, because there are some political scientists around, and it was very painful what you said.
Oh, sorry.
And actually, that's not entirely true. That all the political science, like evaluations and papers on this period of time, they are just avoiding this historization of the period. But it's just a remark which came to my mind. And I've got a question to Florian. Thank you very much for this very nice description of this clash of narratives. And when you're just looking at this very early stage of this clash, basically you can say that actually it all started with the economic dimension of the transformation. And then from the both sides, we can observe some totalness of discourse. I mean, either this criticized side, which you described mostly as the right wing, but we know that there is also some left-wing criticism towards the transformation in Poland at the beginning of the 90s. It started from the economic dimension, like I said, and later on the political, cultural, sociological elements were added. But I want to ask you for your opinion. What is the causality in here and what is the results? Whether the criticism started to be this holistic and then the defense of the transformation has to be holistic as well, or other way around, or it's squeezed away that actually it's very difficult to answer this question now. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think I've seen at least 9 hands go up, so I think maybe collect 3, so one at the front here.
Waldemar Milewicz, Siedlce University of Natural Sciences and Humanities. I would like to pose my questions to Mr. Peters and to Mr. Knoll. So my questions to Mr. Peters. I would like actually to ask you how Germans, so the inhabitants of your home country, perceive Leszek Balcerowicz as one of the most known Polish economists. And my second question, there is a short negative description for Polish economy, and it's Polnische Wirtschaft. Is it still present among inhabitants of your home country? And my questions to Mr. Knoll. What do you think? Is it the pace of privatization in your home country, so in Germany, is appropriate enough? It's my first question. My second question, what's the attitude of the current German government to the privatization? And my last question, what's your personal opinion on privatization? Do you think that some sectors like banking sector should be state-owned and not privatized? Thank you.
Okay, that was a lot of questions. Maybe choose the ones that you're most interested in. You okay? So another. Okay, Joanne?
Just very quickly, I have a question to the Wolf-Rüdiger. It was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much for this. What do you know if there were any Eastern Germans left in the management of the companies, of the enterprises after they were restructured?
Thank you. So, would you like to answer? Florian, do you want to go first?
Thank you for the question. I mean, the question of relationship between economic and cultural dimensions of this political clash, if you want to have this, is of course very difficult to answer for me. As not being a political scientist, I'm not so much concentrating on causalities as social scientists normally do, which I appreciate actually, but I feel a little bit unsure to answer this very straightforward, if you want to have it, because I'm not quite sure whether there is such one-dimensional shift from economic to cultural or social-cultural critique. Actually, I think it was more, maybe I presented it for the purpose of my presentation a little bit too straightforwardly, actually, because from the beginning, I would say that there was a mixture, of course, of cultural and economic modes of critique. If you think about this divide between post-Solidarność and post-communist political forces, which was actually the main divide in Polish politics in the first part of the, or maybe not only in the first part, all through the 1990s, then you can see that that in both factions there are very difficult positions and also critical positions towards economic transformation, and there are very positive ones. So I would say it's rather the affiliation to these political blocks which make the main cleavage, and these economic questions are not discussed as the central cleavage in the political landscape then. And I would say this doesn't really change. Actually, it's always this. Of course, we don't have this post-Solidarność, post-communist blocks anymore. Or they are not as relevant anymore, or this cleavage is not as relevant anymore. But still, it's economic issues are very much discussed in a broader context of cultural issues. And I would rather see a continuity of Polish politics here than a clear shift from the one part from the one dimension to the other one. Maybe this is a first part of an answer to what you're hinting at, which is actually a very, very interesting and intriguing question. I haven't researched as much as I would like to give you a better answer, actually. The question on the perception of Balcerowicz in German, that's a really interesting question, because maybe, as I mentioned very briefly in my presentation, this memory of transformation is very, very national, actually. When I did, some month ago, I was teaching a seminar to a Polish-German group on economic transformation, and it was really interesting for me that the Germans didn't know Balcerowicz, and the Poles didn't know the term Treuhand. Yeah? So both I had to explain to both of them what is actually the same, the very, very central issue of or central point of reference of this memory discourses in two countries. So I would say Balcerowicz is actually he's not seen as this main architect of this first stabilization program, which he was in a way, but he is rather seen by most Germans, I would say, as the one who engineered something which was pre-engineered by the IMF advisors and Jeffrey Sachs and others. And
just briefly, Florian, because we have a lot of questions.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Just one sentence to the gentleman over there. You are so right. I'm very, very sorry. I should have said, as people who claim to be doing political science most often do. But you're absolutely right to emphasize that good political science also should take into account the historical context, and some good political scientists really do it. So really my mistake. My apologies.
Okay, so I try to put it briefly. I'm sorry, the first question you asked, could you repeat?
Is it the pace of privatization in Germany appropriate enough?
The pace of privatization, all right. The interesting thing about is that back in the early 1990s, the federal government of Germany, they actually said we need to do it as fast as possible. It is painful, but the faster we do it, the better it will become in future. So so that was the reason why the Treuhand tried to increase the pace actually of privatization. That was their aim, and the president of the Treuhand, Birgit Breul, she always said that our aim is to well, in a few years that we will not exist anymore. That's the only aim we have is not be there in 3 or 4 or 5 years. So that we will vanish in a couple of years. I don't know if the question is answered that way.
So the attitude to privatization of current government in Germany. Yeah.
So I'm coming to the second one. I think that. well, looking back at the time, the current government, they are still of the opinion, I think, I mean, Florian could say something, or maybe other people in the audience, but I think that it's quite the same then back in the early 1990s. Like, it was a painful process, but it was necessary. So there was no other choice, because we decided to do it that way, and that's the reason we had to do it that way. So, well, the third question about the personal opinion, that's kind of a heavy terrain, I guess. Well, just a few things. Just one thing. I think that when it comes to common good, such as like water supply or public traffic transport, we had kind of another privatization process in the late 1990s, I guess, especially in Berlin. There were kind of disputes about privatizing the electricity sector, and now they took it back a few years ago. So maybe when we talk about common goods, it's very different, or privatization should be very, well, let's say it that way. So it depends on the kind of field of economy. And last thing, the question about the management. There were East Germans in the management, usually not as head of like the boards, but the East Germans were needed by the new West German owners, because these former East German executives, they knew about the companies, they knew about the people working there, they knew about the different kind of branches inside the businesses, so they were definitely needed. But the other problem was that many of them, of the former leaders, business leaders, were somehow involved in the Socialist Party. They were also like the boss of that steel plant in Eisenhüttenstadt. He was also minister for heavy industries. So and there was also a problem that the employees inside the businesses, they wanted to have new people at the top of the businesses. So it's different kind of things. New owners protest against the old ones. So there were not many left, but some. So maybe that way.
Okay, thank you for these. I would ask the questions reasonably brief. And can I ask the organizers, we can go a few minutes over, I guess, but not too many, right? Okay, okay. So, we have another 6 at least, I know. Okay, so, Veronica, you want your next? Okay, where's the, have we lost the microphone? No? Should we do a group here? That's
okay, so I'll try to be brief. First, for Muriel, you talked about these 3 instances of ridiculing democracy, and just to bring in the economists, I was wondering how they kind of fit into your narrative, because you were talking about one of these instances being legal continuity, and the fact that these constitutional lawyers who were former communists, albeit later dissidents, were involved in this legal continuity thesis. But with the economists, it wasn't the 1960s reform economists who kind of came to be those who steered the economic transformation. It was more this group around Václav Klaus, who were kind of let's say in this kind of gray zone, if I really simplify it. So just, I'm wondering if that also fits into your kind of ridiculing democracy thesis, or if there's a different story going on. And a brief question for Wolf-Rüdiger. I'm just wondering if in the collective memory of privatization, I'm struck by the fact that in Germany, the kind of grievances are directed against an institution, against the Treuhand, while in Poland or the Czech Republic, the economic transformation is personalized, right? It's Balcerowicz or it's Václav Klaus in the Czech Republic, who are kind of the representatives of the transformation and privatization. And I'm just wondering if you have any hypothesis on how this changes or structures the collective memory, the fact that it's an institution rather than an individual that people are kind of angry at.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you. On the same point, so actually you just said it, Veronica, but I was going to ask Muriel. So what does it mean that you didn't give us like a name or a tag or like a certain term like Balcerowicz or Treuhand for the Czech case? Does it mean that the privatization in the Czech case is not as emotionally charged? Is it not a memory reference in the same way? Is it maybe like a more positive reference, or is it Klaus? So I would just like to hear more on that point. And then also to Wolf-Rüdiger, I was wondering if you could also say something about, so there's the grievances because of unemployment, because of like the effects of the Treuhand, but there's also the symbolic injury of basically saying that the East German industry was inefficient, right? Which is an economic discourse, but it's also a moral discourse. And so this is, I guess, where also the people come in, like West Germans, who sort of advance that narrative about the East German economy, which is kind of hurtful still till today.
Maybe one more.
Vida from the Institute for European Policy, Europeum from Prague. I would like to have a question on Muriel. Thank you for your presentation. I slightly disagree with you on your perception of the Velvet Revolution, in the sense that I feel that the role of Václav Havel and the dissidents in that time didn't have that large impact on how we in the Czech Republic perceived the democracy afterwards, that the economic transformation was much more important. And just to support the argument, the president in the Czech Republic is usually perceived as somebody standing above the system, above the political system, who doesn't really get involved in everyday politics. And this is basically the role that Václav Havel in that time fulfilled. And so my question is, don't you somehow overestimate the impact of the early days of the revolution, and shouldn't we focus more on what came after the first 3 parliamentary elections?
Thank you. Muriel, do you want to?
Yes. So to Veronica, you're absolutely right to ask this question, because actually it was supposed to be the topic of my talk, as you very well know. But while I was writing it, I ran out of time because I found the context so crucial that, in fact, my talk was, in fact, the introduction to what should have been my talk. But the introduction was very long. How the economists fit into, and why did I spend so much time on this introduction? Is because I think it's absolutely crucial to understand that the dissidents had no or very little legitimacy in 1989. And I think everything departs from there. And how do the economists fit there? Well, because the fixed idea of the dissidents was to get rid of Dubček and get rid generally of the reform communists that were kind of being rehabilitated because they had been so unjustly set aside after '68. And so because they had to get rid of Dubček, that caused 3 things. One is they had to find allies, and because Dubček was a Slovak, that he played a double role, like they had to get rid of both the Slovaks and of the reform communists, which had 2 effects. One is, very briefly afterwards, the breakup of the federation, which really started there. That's one thing. And the second thing is a very harsh turnabout and policy of anti-communism, because the only difference between the dissidents and the reform communists is that they were not communists. So they kind of put forward this argument of not being communist in a much more strong way than they would have had to do if Dubček had not been there, which is why I even put, I think, in my abstract, what about if Dubček had, let's say, had died in the 1980s from natural causes? I believe it would not have been necessary to be quite so anti-communist as the revolution became. And it was the idea was really to get rid of Dubček. And the third consequence was, since they could not count on the Slovaks, since they could not count on the reform communists, and since they were not very legitimate, who else could they take as allies? Well, the economists. And that's when Klaus steps in. That's how Klaus appears at the meeting of civic forums, and Klaus is willing to support Havel and the Občanský fórum and the civic forum, so He's given a role that he probably would not have been given otherwise, again. Which is why, again, historicizing the revolution is absolutely crucial to understanding what happened afterwards, because this is really decided in a few weeks. And had it taken in another way, then things would have also been taken a very different course after 89.
Briefly.
Yeah. Oh, well, I will kind of evacuate the second question. Is privatization as emotionally charged as in the other countries? Is a little bit the same. Klaus was given a much bigger role than he would have had in other circumstances. And it was emotionally charged, but okay, it's too complicated. I will not get into it now. And to your point that the role of Havel was not that important to the Czech population, whereas the economic reform was, that is absolutely true. And I cannot really explain, but I think there's a real connection, and I'm still trying to find a way to express it in words. That even though the people don't know the details of what happened during the revolution, nevertheless, the behavior, nevertheless, it created an atmosphere of distrust. And I cannot exactly justify why, but I'm sure of it. I'm still trying to find a way to really explain it. But if you, because of course people didn't know what was happening inside the meetings. We know it only now, right? So it's not like people were thinking, oh, this behavior is unacceptable, so I don't trust democracy anymore. It's not like that. And nevertheless, I think this behavior that was not very democratic somehow must have shown on the outside one way or the other that people understood that somehow the revolution was not as pure as they were given to think. But it's difficult to explain. So, but thank you. Your remark is absolutely justified.
Do you want to say something, or should we?
Yeah, I think there are some questions to be answered, but I'll put it very briefly. First, the collective memory of privatization, the protest against an institution or against against a person. I think that's an interesting perspective. I don't know, talking about the Treuhand, well, the presidents of the Treuhand were heavily criticized. I mean, I said something about the first was not, well, it was kind of the first real president of the Treuhand. He was shot by, well, that case was never really, you say, solved or whatever. It's very likely that it was like from a left-wing terror organization. So, but nevertheless, and also Birgit Breuel, the successor of Detlev Carsten Rohwedder, her reputation was and is still very bad. I mean, she received letters full of hate. We could see it in the archives, and still her name is, you know, closely linked to Treuhand and has a very bad reputation. I think that maybe because the Treuhand changed its shape and its purpose from like something that, you know, tried to maintain the public ownership and the shares for the East German people, to a privatization agency. That's one thing, and the other thing is there is not one person who like invented the Treuhand. That was kind of a process of the civil movement and also some kind of political thing. So there is not the one person you could really like blame for inventing that privatization agency whatsoever. The other thing about the East German economy and the feeling of the inefficiency by the East Germans, well, I think it depends on, you know, the point of view, because for East Germans it was difficult to understand what's happening, because we talk about economic developments in a market, on free markets, whereas before the East German companies, they would, you know, work in that Comic-Con, I mean, together with other, the socialist countries. And now, since the market was opened, it was not possible, like, to produce chips, microchips. I mean, there was a very modern production plan for chips in the city of Frankfurt, but it could only work in that kind of socialist economy. Because when the markets were opened, it was clear that in Japan these chips were produced way cheaper than in East Germany, and this plant could never survive. But for the people, they felt like, well, that's a new plant. We produce new products. It's very modern. Why must this plant? What's the reason why our plant has to be closed? We can't understand. So that's kind of complicated to explain to the people who produce things. And maybe that's the last point. Maybe that also has something to do with the term of the value. When we talk about the value, I forgot the name of the author, but there is a relatively new book that's called The Value of Everything that deals with how do we value things. Usually in the free markets, we take money in order to evaluate or to bring it together to say the value of something is the price. But in East Germany, it was not always about the price. It was also about just the thing people produce. So, and this is something where socialist economy would collide with free market. So maybe that's some kind of explanation for these problems of, painful experiences.
Okay. I'm getting signals to wind up. So I know there are some people in the audience who didn't have the opportunity to ask questions, and I apologize for that. But also, we're glad we got so many questions for a very stimulating panel, so can you join me in thanking all speakers?